that what Atlantic did in particular, I think more than Open Society and Ford, and I hope that one day we can emulate what Atlantic did, was to set the bar quite high for giving in relation to issues that are quite neglected or politically neglected. And if it wasn't for Atlantic's funding, I mean, all of our work around sexual orientation, protection and equality of rights, from civil union marriages to challenging unfair discriminatory policies, to issues around HIV/AIDS, to issues around being queer, in South Africa, to issues around being a sex worker, that was all of the work that Atlantic led. And it was because Atlantic was willing to take the risk, and Atlantic was willing to do that risque funding, that other donors were able to actually come into that space.
And I think this is very important in the long term, is that anyone who's committed to building democracy, and anyone who's committed to social justice more broadly, has to be committed to the inclusion of those at the margins, those at the sexual margins, those at the gendered margins, those at the economic margins. And so in a sense, you've seen, I think, many more people speaking out against, for example, violence against LGBT people than you ever saw, 10 years ago. So that kind of diversification, let's say, and a real interest amongst a range of social justice activists to take on LGBTI equality and justice issues is a very significant shift I think we've seen in the last 4 to 5 years.
Focusing on marginal groups in their broad sense makes LGBTI struggles part of a broader movement for social justice, and we think that that's a transformative agenda. And that is probably the approach that has more traction, more likelihood of success in this part of the world.
I think one of the footprints that I think will be left by Atlantic funding has been the opportunity to provide education to the police services and information to the magistrates. There's very little awareness of how far people would walk and for how long to get to South Africa. It's not a thing you undertake lightly. You flee war, you flee trauma, you flee peril. We now are in a position to provide training, or not training, to provide information for magistrates throughout this province in the Refugee Act, the Immigration Act, to do the same for the police, to provide copies of the documentation, to make sure that people know what the obligations of the Constitution are and how they should treat a migrant or a foreigner or an asylum seeker, because those people are entitled to the same rights as South Africans. I think that awareness is one of the footprints that we'll be able to leave with Atlantic's funding.
So it wasn't around how can we help these poor LGBT groups or the poor refugees and migrants, but very much around how do we empower these groups to self-organize and mobilize and come into their own. And you've seen the fruits of that over the years within the LGBT sector, the refugee and migrant sector, the rural women's sector. And it was because Atlantic was saying we're placing the people that we care about at the center of our funding model. Ford has also tried to emulate that in many respects in terms of the way we think about the groups that we care about, from a very trying not to be patronizing, because we funders tend to patronize the groups we care about, and work from a much more empowerment approach, which is, I think, the history of Atlantic's work in the LGBT sector probably speaks to that most powerfully.
When you focus on actual communities of people, groups of people, actual people in an environment who are marginal, that takes you much more into a transformative social justice agenda. That takes you into a sphere of work that is about strengthening organization of groups, strengthening the voice of groups in their context, but also in global advocacy, and strengthening the relationship between those groups and other actors.